Turn the floor over to Alan, and he's going to provide us with Go West Young Man.
Okay, I do quite a bit of work in social media, and I'm recording this though for the benefit of my kids and my grandchildren. I really want them to be able to hear these stories. I really wish that I had these type of devices when I was talking with my own father and my grandfather, because I think there's times there are a lot of stories that are lost. How many in this group have done the DNA tests? Yeah, from Ancestor.com. I've done Ancestor.com, and I've also done the National Geographic studies, and so I got my results back. And sure enough, my DNA is from the Fertile Valley and around the Mediterranean, of course, up through Northern Europe and England, coming over. But then I also discovered that my DNA has from here. And so on my father's side, my Patriot side, my great-grandmother, Elizabeth Cincinnatus, was born in Colorado, and her father, Joe, I never met Joe. He has long since had been passed by the time I was born, but the family stories were that the quickest way to get him into a fight was to call him a Mexican. In his mind, he was full-blooded Spanish, and you know, in the late 1800s, 1860s, of course, the Indian Wars, going from like 1830 to 1890, many people feel like Wounded Knee was the end of the Indian Wars. To be anything other than Northern European was to just ask to have prejudice against you. So you could probably see why he was feeling that way. But I thought that the DNA aspect is what really got me thinking about this Go West, young man, go west. And of course, if you are a student of history, Horace Greeley, the great newspaper magnate, was the one who said, "Go west, young man, go west. Go west and find your riches." But Horace Greeley was also the one who said, "These people must die out. There's no help for them. God has given the earth to those who will subdue and cultivate it." And so the fact of the matter is that while this part of the world had Alexander the Great, who conquered much of this part, and Rome, 1,000 years. And the Romans were known for building the infrastructure. I mean, at one point, the phrase, "all roads lead to Rome." Think of the aqueducts and the roads that they built from northern Africa all the way up into the UK. This area had been brought together in a way where people at least knew of each other. There was no Alexander the Great. There was no Rome on this side of the ocean. And I think and maybe there was, but at least at this point, history hasn't uncovered that. And so this is something to really think about. There was no Alexander the Great, no Rome here. And so as our patriots, our ancestors, moved this way, this really was the Wild West. And to just bring that home, how many watch the PBS, like to watch PBS type story? Yeah, absolutely. Tom Hanks is the speaker. It's called Horatio's Drive. And Horatio Jackson in 1903 was the first person actually to drive a car from coast to coast. It took 63 days in 1903. In 1903, there were only 150 miles of paved roads, and almost all of that was only in cities. So he was following cow paths, railroad tracks. I mean, it truly, this was probably the adventure of a lifetime, but I'll pass this around. If you have a chance to watch that, it is so entertaining. But to think about the fact that as 1903, I mean, okay, it's 2018, but still, just a little over 100 years ago, there were only 150 miles of paved roads in our country, almost all of those in the city. All roads lead to Rome. There were no roads here. And so again, this western migration was something else. It wasn't like you could just go to your local convenience store and get a map. I'm going to pass these around. Take a look at them. These are different maps of the world, starting in 1700, going through 1900. And why did I pick that time frame? Well, my patriot, the ancestors of my patriot started in about 1700, and in 1900, my great-grandfather ended up homesteading in the eastern plains of Colorado. So, John C., my patriot, born basically in what's the border between West Virginia and Virginia now, ends up buried in Illinois. Makes it that far. His son, Pioneer Certificate, one of the first to Iowa. Go west, young man, go west. When Horace Greeley said that, he was speaking to J.B. Grinnell, the founder of Grinnell, Iowa, my hometown. And so Iowa, if you think about Iowa, really kind of unique from the standpoint that on the eastern side is bordered by the Mississippi, on the western side bordered by the Missouri. Think about 1800 with Lewis and Clark, starting off in St. Louis, the gateway of the West, following the Missouri up north through the Dakotas, where they were bordering Iowa there, and then going on. And so then in Colorado, my great-grandfather marrying Elizabeth Cincinnatus and settling there. My grandfather, Josie, born and raised in a sod cabin, son of the Saudis. So in Colorado, not too many trees and stuff like that in the eastern side of the state. You're getting in there close to Nebraska and Kansas and that area. And so again, this western migration was not anything easy by any standards. So let's just, and again, just chime in if you have your own family stories of how your patriot or how your ancestors started to come over. But let's think a little bit about world history and what kind of drove people to leave this area of the country and push this way. Well, so my 10th great-grandfather, Johannes Z., and his wife, Anna. Okay, you in the 1618, you got the 30-year war, and this was brutal, and people in Europe at the end of that were really struggling from that standpoint. Are there people here who have Mayflower descendants? Okay, yeah, right. So in 1607, 1606, they're leaving the UK, or they're leaving the UK. They're going over to the Dutch. They've been there about 10 years. At this point, they're going, well, we're still English. I mean, we like that we have more freedom here, but we're still English. But what we don't like is the fact that our children are being around all the Dutch. They're becoming Dutch, and that's not what we want. And so they got this factor going on. Then along with the fact that there's this war brewing, and they're thinking, we got to get out of here. And so in 1620, they're landing in Plymouth, which is great. And of the 100 people on the Mayflower, about 50 of them, they weren't happy that the other 50 weren't a part of their core group, but they have their core group. So we think about the Pilgrims being early, but actually they were far from the first. In fact, The Spanish are 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. The Spanish are already making waves here. In fact, the oldest city in the U.S. is St. Augustine, 1565, founded with the Spanish. The oldest church in the U.S., it's in Santa Fe. My wife and I have been there, established in 1610. That's 10 years before the Pilgrims. So think about that. Is we think about the activity all here on the East Coast, but you've got the Spanish coming in through here. In fact, in the 1600s, something like 25% of Spain's gross national product is silver and gold from the New World. So they're already coming in through here. In fact, right here is Robinson Crusoe Island, Jonathan Defoe's Treasure Island. So the character for that is stranded right here, and that is the story for Robinson Crusoe. So you've got Spain who's thinking, come this way, sail around here. They find Panama, where what's now the Panama Canal, sail back, quickest trade route. The Dutch and the Portuguese are already coming over here to Japan and China in the 1600s. So the economy is already becoming global. You've got the Dutch, you've got the Portuguese coming over here, the Dutch also going to North America, Spain is coming this way, and of course England wanting to get in on this. Well, so you've got this 30-year war going on, and economics drives a lot of behavior. Well, what happens in 1708, 1709 is a very, very harsh, two harsh winters and crop failure. And so the people are literally starving. And also, you want to talk about, in a way, marketing. There's a book called The Golden Book, and it was called The Golden Book because actually the print and everything was golden, but it was probably, like in today's world, like an infomercial. And it was written because England is wanting people to come over here for their naval stores project. Well, all these countries now are going global with all these ships. They need tar, and they need lumber to make these fleets. And so they're trying to convince people that this is a really cool place to go. You know, come here, get land. You can pay off the debt to get here by cutting down the trees and supplying the tar, because we need this tar to make ships. And so this is driving this activity. Now, probably what they're not telling people is that in getting here, not only is traveling from Germany over to England and then coming across a very tough trip, but also, I mean, this is during the time of pirates and stuff like that. I mean, Blackbeard, Edwin Teach, he's killed off the North Carolina coast in 1718. So coming over, landing in North Carolina is no simple thing. I'm pretty sure that probably wasn't something mentioned in the Golden Book. So what's going on? There was a huge German migration around the 1718, 1720 time frame, but my Patriots ancestors, John and Anna, actually came with the Palatine migration in 1709. So they've gone through a couple of crop failures, and so they're wanting to get out of there. My family, on both my paternal and maternal side, were farmers. I mean, that was what their trade was. They were farmers, so they were looking for land. And in fact, my family stayed farmers up until my dad. My dad and his two brothers, who were born in the 30s during the Depression, there in Iowa, did not become farmers. So for basically 200 years, the family were farmers looking for land in order to be able to make a living. And as you think about the way the land opened up, that was what was pushing them. Now, they seem to always be right on that cutting, maybe bleeding edge. In fact, my patriot, John, his father, Frederick, was scalped and killed during the Muddy Creek Massacre, which I talked about last year. So again, you think about the transportation, the flatboat and the Conestoga wagon don't make their appearance until 1750. So the horse, think about the horse. The Spanish introduced the Mustang when they're coming over, but the Mustang was pretty much built for that arid type of country. They can eat native grass. They don't need much water. But up until then, the North American natives, Indians, their beast of burden was a dog, and a dog can't pull very much. So very, very kind of small tent poles and stuff like that. It really wasn't until they had the horse and started to become horsemen that they started to be able to move greater distances and things like that. So again, that's influencing this area. So 1708, 1709, famine coming off of the 30-year war. They as it was not big cities and stuff moving, it was really more chaotic. It was individual families. It wasn't kind of like the Pilgrims and a 50 people core group. These were just small groups of families saying, I have to get out of here. And so they think just about this move from going from Germany across and being able to get to the UK. They lived in, it was like a tent city. And it took them a long time before they finally were able to get the ships. And then they don't end up going to North Carolina. They take them off to New York. So let's move to New York. How many had ancestors that landed in New York? New York. Where else did they? Any other area? So
Virginia colony.
Okay, Virginia,
Yeah.
and then also Plymouth, right?
Plymouth, yeah, well, that's unconfirmed. My DNA goes back 6 generations, that's confirmed.
Okay.
I have Thomas Williams supposedly was on the Mayflower, it's unconfirmed.
Okay.
In Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. Okay. All right. So Jamestown, the Dutch. So we're really the Spanish coming in. You think about it, we're real and coming in kind of from the back door. I mean, coming from Central America, North Mexico, and coming up that way versus coming from the east going west. But you've got the Dutch who were very early in, and in fact, if you look at Jamestown, 1607, the Pilgrims, 1620, New Amsterdam, which became New York City, 1624. The Dutch coming in really in the early 1600s. In fact, Albany, Henry Hudson for the Dutch in 1609, the first European settlement 1614, and it became a city in 1686. So the Dutch are coming into New York and already traveling up into the Albany area. So my ancestors coming in land in New York. They've had this trip. Here's these Palatine Germans coming in, and they've had to live in tent city in London before they could even get to the U.S. They lost 3 kids on the trip over. They land in New York, and the people in New York are going, "Oh my God, do not let those people off the boat. They look hideous." And oh no, they look absolutely hideous. Well, they do get off, but they're given 40 acres of land, and of course, the idea of making tar for the naval project is like, no, that's not gonna happen. And so, several of the families say, well, we hear that the Indians up here in around Albany will sell us some land. So they make their way up to Scolari, the Scolari area, which is kind of a little, kind of south and a little bit east of Albany, present day Albany. And of course, the Dutch had already settled Albany. So they're trying to deal with the Indians to get some land. Now think about this, there was no written language, no titles, and the Indians' concept of land ownership was totally different from the Europeans. So who actually owned the land? And when you think about that, those first people there trying to get land and establish who really owned it, the Indians, based on their tribes, and these were the tribes that were in that area, were pretty much whoever has the biggest tribe at the time can make believe whether or not they sell it or not. And so it's not like the land, and in fact, Penn, in trying to establish Pennsylvania, it wasn't until the mid-1700s that he was finally able to tell people and give them the title of land ownership for sure. So this was all very iffy. So I'm going to read a quick story about this. So these Palatines come up to Scolari, and they think that they've got this land. Well, but the land had been claimed by a group in England, and then the group in England realized that they couldn't really control it, sell it off to another group. Unbeknownst to the Palatines, others had land claims on the area that presented challenges to their land rights. The first of these challenges came in 1714 from Nicholas Bayard, who claimed that the Indians sold him the land prior to Indian arrangements with the Palatines. Having survived many hardships and still smarting from the deceit suffered under Hunter, Hunter was the individual in New York, they ran Baird out of the area. Baird sold the Scolari title to the 7 partners. So now you've got one person selling it to another, although they didn't own it either. A group of, which was a group of British investors who purchased land in the new colonies to reap the benefits of its vast purchase of its vast natural resources. In 1715, the 17 partners issued an edict to the Palatines to purchase, lease, or leave the land that was occupied them. Well, you can imagine them. They're like, well, we've already negotiated and gave stuff to the Indians. We're here. We're not going to pay you again. Agents of the 7 partners attempting to enforce this edict were subjected to severe mistreatment. One agent is reported to have been dunked in pig mire, dragged through the settlement, and eventually left on the old Albany Road, suffering 2 broken ribs and badly bruised ego. So this was the kind of cleaned up version. Now reading this from my father's research from another person, and this is why I have Anna with the star here. But when the sheriff began to meddle with the first man, a mob of women rose, of which Magdalena Z was captain. He was knocked down and dragged through every mud pool in the street, then hung on a rail and carried 4 miles down on a bridge. Run out of town on a rail? Where the captain took a stake out of the fence and struck him in the side, that she broke 2 ribs and lost 1 eye. Then she pissed in his face and let him lie and went off. This is one tough person, and this was, but you can just imagine where this is coming from.
Life and death. They felt that was life and death. They were going to lose everything they came all the way over for.
Absolutely. Starting off in Germany, I endured this tent city in London. I lost 3 kids coming over here. Then you gave me crummy land in New York that there's no way I was going to make tar for you, because the 40 acres wasn't support that. now I've come up here and battled and negotiated with Indians, and now one group says they own this, and now another group says they own this, and you're telling me that I still have to pay you again? I don't think so. So that just kind of lets you know how tough this time really was. Well, their son, George, who was actually born in Germany, so Johannes and Anna are buried here. Their son, who was actually born in Germany, decides to come down to Pennsylvania. Well, again, I've been telling you, as far as William Penn, he was enticing people to come there, but it still wasn't like he could give somebody full and correct title to the land. So I'm sure they're feeling again that, you know, how do I get this? What's going on during this time? Well, traders from the Ohio Company are moving into the Ohio River Valley. This is where, at that point, this is really kind of considered the Wild West. Wild West. Not many people moving or have gone past. Baltimore isn't established until 1730. The French Indian War, 1744 to 1766. This is huge. More people were actually killed during that than during the Revolution. And when you think about it, this was really when the Indians still weren't united, but you've got to be thinking, and this is kind of like I'm taking some liberties here, like a historical novel, but thinking in their heads, oh my gosh, all right, well, let's see. Maybe if we partner with these French guys and beat the English, all these white people will leave. Because right now, it's been devastating for them. When you think about when, and this still kind of blows my mind. So when the Dutch and the Portuguese are landing in Japan and China, I haven't read history where Japan and China, large groups of populations were just literally wiped out. Has anybody read anything at all along those lines? I haven't, but European colonizations of the Americas, it's believed that 95% of the indigenous population was killed off by disease brought by the Europeans, whether it's smallpox, measles, influenza. I mean, think about the Mayflower people. When they landed there at Plymouth, where they built their city, I mean, it was basically an area of bones. There had been a tribe there, a city there of 2,000 people, and literally when the first Europeans were coming up into this area, that plague just came through here, and in a very short order was like wiping the native population out. They had no antibodies or way to be able to survive the European diseases. So it was, again, just, devastating, for them. So the French Indian War, you've got to be thinking that the Indians are, at some point, we've got to put a stake in the ground and try and stop this. Although, again, there are all these independent nations. It's not like they're a Rome or something like that. So their son, who's born here in Scolari, so as an adult, he marries somebody from Albany. They have a son moving here. Now they're moving to the frontier, and this is where the Muddy Creek Massacre happens. It's kind of at the end of the French Indian War, before the Revolution, and I'll just read a short. It's kind of funny. This is about on my paternal side, but these are women that I'm reading the story about. Catherine Vanderpool. So she was born in Albany. So her background Dutch. One of those, her family, one of the very early people to come in. And she marries Frederick. It's at the end of the French Indian War, and Chief Cornstalk comes down from Ohio and they are raiding and wiping out the people in this area. Catherine Vanderpool was involved in one of the worst massacres in early Virginia history, known as the Muddy Creek Massacre, which occurred in Greenbrier County, Virginia, on July 16, 1763. Her husband Frederick was killed and scalped, and she was taken captive by the Shawnee Indian with several of her children. Several accounts of this incident show that she showed incredible bravery during her captivity, which no doubt saved the lives of Catherine and her children. On the way to Ohio, so Cornstalk is killing these people, taking them captive, and then bringing them up to where the Shawnee village was at the time, which is just south of Columbus, between Columbus and Cincinnati. On the way to Ohio, those women and children who were unable to keep up were killed. Her grandson, the child of Margaret's heroes, was killed. The youngest son, John, that's my patriot, was quite weak, and Catherine feared for his life. Seeing a warrior riding their horse, Catherine indicated to him that she wanted it. When he refused, she picked up a club and attempted to knock him off the horse. About to kill her, the amused Indians prevented the warrior from doing so. Once they reached the Shawnee settlement, which is now Ross County, Ohio, Catherine was called upon to run the gauntlet. Grabbing a stick, she began making whirling moves, swirling the stick, which pleased all the warriors greatly. When cold weather came, there was not enough room inside for all the prisoners, so one of Catherine's sons had to sleep outside with the dogs to keep warm. She became the fifth wife of her captor, Chief Cornstalk. A document written by Colonel Henry Bouquet to William Penn, governor of Pennsylvania, on November 15, 1764, stated that all the tribes led by Chief Cornstalk had at least agreed to release the prisoners, not only from the incident at the Sea Home, but the number of other similar incidents at other family homes on the South Branch. Catherine and at least some of her children must have been separated during captivity because her youngest son, John, was adopted by the Shawnee family who had lost their son. John became very fond of his new family. When the time came for the Shawnee to release the prisoners, all the Sea family except 9-year-old Elizabeth were freed. Cornstalk would not let her go, but kept her for 9 more years, during which time his son married her. So, John C., my patriot, which when you read a lot in the 1850s when the Comanche and stuff would take settlers, that being 8, 9 years old was kind of the perfect age to kind of be adaptable, and he became Indianized. And so I can only imagine when he was fighting in the Revolution what it must have been like to fight against him, because he knew both worlds, and I'm sure he was very, very brutal in his way of fighting. So now we're getting to the point of the Revolution starting, and this was in the SAR magazine, the Battle of Point Pleasant, which is kind of considered like the start of it. This is where Cornstalk was. Well, you think about the colonial volunteers that are showing up there. Well, John's older brother is there. And you can bet that those Virginians who are showing up there, many of them who were from the South Branch area, are there for blood. And so again, that history tying together there. Well, from there, John fights at Germantown, Monmouth, Stony Point. So he's in Pennsylvania, New York. He spends the winter in Valley Forge, and then gets out of the army, comes back to the South Branch area, and then starts moving. And he actually, with his son, John Jr., end up here in what's probably right between Indianapolis and probably right on Interstate 70. In fact, it's Newcastle, Indiana. And in the first book of marriages, John C. Jr. marries Nancy Morris. It's the third marriage in the first book of marriages in 1825 there in Henry County. So Indiana, which is Indianapolis, this was very much considered Indian country, but he's one of the first people, settlers moving into Indiana. John Jr. and his brother head to Illinois. His father and mother, my patriot, come here. John Margaret is buried here in Indiana, and John, my patriot, ends up moving to where his two sons are, and this is where he dies. So my patriot, starting off here in Pennsylvania, going through the Muddy Creek Massacre, being hauled off to Ohio as a captive, fighting in the Revolution, coming back, ending up in Illinois. Again, there's no cars. There's no trains. There's no planes. And so this is, walking, literally walking and going that distance. And he lived to be about 80 years old. And, my gosh, he had to be one tough individual. So, think about this now. We've got the Louisiana Purchase in 1801, and Lewis and Clark SAR here in St. Louis, which was then considered the gateway of the West, following the Missouri up into this area and over. Again, it's not like the French. It's kind of funny. Okay, the U.S. buys this from the French, but who are the French to sell it to us? I mean, really, did the French have title to this? Of course they didn't, and of course the Indians that they met along the way are like, I don't know. How many have watched that movie with Dances with Wolves? Yeah,
Kevin Costner.
Yeah, Kevin Costner. Yeah. Wait, I love that part of the movie where he's talking with these Indians, and this one Indian shows up with an old Spanish conquistador helmet, and they're like, my father, my grandfather, my great grandfather ran you guys out. We'll do it again. No problem. And Costner's like, what you don't understand is like these Europeans, white men, are like the stars in the sky. They're just millions. I mean, they're just going to keep coming. They're just going to keep coming. And really, when you think about it, that is that and the where did I write that down? How many have read the book Guns, Steel, and Germs? It is a great book. It really is kind of a book of the settlement of going that way, in that the fact of not having resistance to the type of diseases that were in Europe and stuff like that, is that these were the type of things that made the difference in the U.S. and through manifest destiny being able to go this way. But when you think about it, had this part of the world had a Rome or an Alexander the Great already been united in the same way that Europe was, how different history might have been. So we've got the Harrison Land Acts, which this is the very beginning of trying to move the Indians west, and eventually most of them being ending up in the Oklahoma type of territory. We had the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, which in that point, of course, in the Civil War is when a lot of fighting skills and everything were honed. But when you think about the people who were in charge during kind of that major part of the Indian Wars, Grant was president at that point, Sherman, Custer, these people all had their teeth cut and their fighting skills honed during that Mexican-American War. And they, the mentality of that time really wasn't about negotiating. It was about let's move them to some area because we're gonna open this up. Again, it still wasn't something that was easy for the settlers. My family, as I told you, were farmers, and they centralized right around the Grinnell area. Probably coming in right about that same time J.B. Grinnell was coming in and following the advice of Horace Greeley, and this really was kind of a fertile area. My great-grandfather did take it a step farther, going all the way to Colorado in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and trying to make a go of it here. This is where he met his wife, and as I said, her DNA coming up from this area. They did go back to the Iowa area, which is where my father was born. My grandfather, in following the wheat and everything, ended up here on the Minnesota, North Dakota border is where he met my grandmother. They ran away and eloped, much to the dislike of his father and father-in-law. But they were big wheat farmers here in North Dakota, from Dutch descent. So I think it's interesting to think about your family and what kind of economics and world events were going on that would incent or create the motivation for someone to literally pack up, and probably didn't have much, but to say, we're gonna pack up and we're gonna take off to an area where, I don't know where the maps are, but we really don't know where we're going. We have no idea where we're going or what it really looks like. All we have is what other people have said about it, and some of those are fairy tales, and we really don't know what it's going to be like, to get there. So they were really jumping into the unknown, and then once getting here, and how hard life really was, and the thought of moving here and really being the first people to till the land and to do that, and trying to live around the Native Americans as they were still in this area, had to be something that I just can't even imagine. Oh, one final story, and this is kind of cool. Do any of you get this magazine called The Week? This is really kind of an interesting magazine. It has, but this was the article from this last magazine, The Dress That Drove the Slave Trade, Marie Antoinette. This was a painting of her, and it was kind of scandalous at the time, but Marie Antoinette was like the fashion goddess of the time. What she wore, what she did, what she said, Europe kind of followed. And she had her picture painted, and she was wearing, of all things, and it was really the first painting of that nature of someone wearing that. She was wearing a dress made of cotton, and people looked at cotton at that time as that's what the peasants wear. We wear it, but here's Marie Antoinette wearing a cotton dress, and it's like it became a fashion thing. Cotton became very popular, and at that point in the U.S., of course, there was cotton being raised, but it wasn't like it was a major trade item at that point. But that painting sparked a demand for cotton, and of course, cotton is what kept slavery going in the U.S. And so again, it's just amazing how a single person, an Alexander the Great or Marie Antoinette or whatever, can drive economic and behavior that can influence a country or the whole world. So I went over a little bit, but
I have a question for you.
yep.
Maybe you will know, maybe you won't, but a lot of the beginning of your story mirrors what happened to my family with the border of France and Germany, that border moves back and forth. I think they call it the SAR area. After the 30 Years' War, a group of mine come over and they settle in the Connecticut area.
Okay.
And then all of a sudden, there's another part of the family that are Canadian fur traders. And I've never been able to figure out if they came up from Connecticut or was there a port in Canada that some of those French people went to? Where was that port in Canada?
Yeah, so, the Dutch and even the French, and this was very, very interesting, were landing up here because at this point, okay, so Columbus thought he had found India. Well, okay, now the Dutch and the Portuguese are all going to China and Japan and stuff. At that point, people are still thinking there's this Northwest Passage. And it's at this point that they're finding the Great Lakes. And, you know, they get this far. It only takes them, okay, so now they're finding the Great Lakes and they're going, oh, there's some pretty cool resources here, particularly beaver. And beaver hats were very big. It only takes them about 50 years to wipe out the beaver. And so then, okay, they eventually find out about fishing and it's said that the logging from this area, I don't know, it's like if you took all the timber that was taken from this area and laid it end to end, that's like circled the globe like scores of times. They really just depleted this area. Eventually, they find minerals and the iron and industry and stuff here. But I would say they could have gone up, but I would say more likely they were coming in from this area as a part of the Hudson Bay Company and stuff like that, and trying to be a part of that, finding the Northwest Passage. Because it wasn't until like the early 1700s that they're finally over to this far, and they're going, oh, okay, there's not a passage. And then of course Lewis and Clark again thinking there was a passage, find out, okay, there's not. It's going to be a long ways to go across the rest of the way.
But there wasn't like a city in Canada that the Hudson Bay people all landed at?
Yeah, Montreal.
And Quebec,
And-
Quebec is the oldest.
Yeah.
Quebec is east of Montreal.
Right.
So but the people was probably landed here in Newfoundland and then came in, because there's a lot of controversy over who founded Newfoundland. I think it's the Vikings.
Yeah.
And they think that a lot of the people that came in from the north, like the Vikings, they came in through that way, through Newfoundland, and then down the St. Lawrence Seaway at that time. But back in the early 1700s and the late 1600s, there was a lot of copper mining up in Upper Peninsula in Michigan. If you go there today, there's an awful lot of copper that's there, and that was a big draw for that area. They believe that they shipped a lot of copper back to Europe from finding that in that area up in actually it's in the Kewanee Peninsula that goes into Lake Superior. There's a bunch of copper mines up there, and it's a high-grade ore that they found. In fact, they used to throw silver out because they didn't have a license.
Yeah.
So when they mined the copper, the silver was thrown out the back door, and they would find guys that they didn't have a license to mine silver. So these people were ambushed and beaten up pretty badly for stealing silver off the scrap pile. But that's that whole history up in there. There's the beaver, of course, and then the copper was a big thing. And then the iron ore was further west in Minnesota, in that area. So all of that area is a lot of French history.
Right.
A lot of French priests that came over and started churches in that area.
Right, and which was the same for the Spanish
Right,
in
right.
the south, which is why Santa Fe is
Right.
the way it is.
But Quebec was the big city at that time, and then they said further west, they found Montreal, and then everything. Of course, our county, that's named after Montgomery, that was from the from the Revolutionary War, the fight with Quebec there. But Quebec was a city many years before that.
Yeah, it's just fortunate the way that, as far as the Pilgrims in 1620, that the record keeping and the stories that were written is kind of what's perpetuated that, and we think about that as being the founding, and yet the founding was really way earlier than that. I mean, 100 years, more than 100 years earlier, when you think about fur traders and people coming from the north and coming into this area, the Spanish coming up from this area. I mean, when I was living in the Abilene, Wichita Falls, Texas area and covering my territory, I came across markers all the time of groups of Spanish conquistadors who were coming up through there battling the Apache and stuff like that in the 15, 16, hundreds.
Now there's a lot of controversy over whether the Templars came over here. There's evidence that there may have come over in the Newfoundland and Canada area. So they think maybe some of the Templars who came over here to store, well, at Oak Island, I don't know if you're watching that or not, but they're looking for that fabled treasure that's on Oak Island.
Yeah.
And I think the Templars brought some treasure over after 1307 or something, when they were devastated by the French king. And they think they escaped and brought the treasure over here and hid it there in Oak Island. That's what they're looking for now. Digging holes all over the place. But Franklin Roosevelt got involved in that.
Did he? Okay.
Yes,
Wow.
he was one of the investors in the Oak Island treasure thing back before he was president.
I don't know, but I mean, for me, these stories and everything just really excite me around history and being able to, think about that. I mean, I'm so happy and honored to be a part of the Sons of the American Revolution, and just everything that surrounds that, both before and after, is really the growing up of our nation.
Where did you get the first person account that you were reading out of that book?
It was from, let's see.
That's the book your dad put together?
Yeah, it was from John M. Brown, 1823. A brief sketch of the first settlement of the county of Scolari by the Germans. John M. Brown, 1823. Yeah, these.
That's really neat when you can find a reference
Yeah,
that close to home.
These stories like that are something else.
It's fascinating history.
It is.
This country is fascinating.
It is. And,
One thing came to mind when you were talking about the Dutch settling in New York. It's kind of relative to the Revolutionary War. President Van Buren, our first president, U.S.-born president, was from New York, and he had Dutch ancestry.
Yeah.
That came to mind when you
Yeah.
said that.
Yeah, the Dutch, the Portuguese, I mean, they were, Portuguese, Spanish, I mean, they were really out there as explorers, really trying to figure out the globe and how things were connected. And of course, they were in it for a buck. They were in it for a buck. There's no doubt about it. All right.
Very nice, thank you.